And those sort of observations are critical to me.
Princess Anne just opened a sealed envelope that Queen Elizabeth hid for 3 years, and what she found inside has left the entire royal family in absolute shock. A secret clause about Prince Harry's inheritance that nobody saw coming. £20 million, impossible conditions, and a grandmother's final plea that could either reunite the royals or tear them apart forever. What the Queen wrote in her own shaking hand will make your jaw drop. Anne is furious. Charles has no idea what's coming.
Tonight, we're all here together to focus on what remains one of the most pressing issues of our time.
And Harry? He's about to receive the most shocking phone call of his life. It's late December 2025, and Princess Anne has just uncovered something her mother left behind. Queen Elizabeth II, who passed away in September 2022, had secrets that not even her closest family members knew about. And now, more than 3 years after her death, one of those secrets has come to light in the most unexpected way. Princess Anne is perhaps the most dedicated member of the royal family. While king, Charles claimed the title of hardest working royal in 2025 with 532 official engagements. Anne came in a very close second with 478 duties carried out throughout the year. This is a woman who has devoted her entire life to the monarchy, who works tirelessly without complaint, and who has earned a reputation for absolute loyalty to the institution and to her family. She's known for being straightforward, no nonsense, and deeply committed to duty above all else. What makes Anne's position in this story so unique is her relationship with her late mother during those final hours. On September 8, 2022, when Queen Elizabeth died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, Princess Anne was the only member of the immediate royal family present at her mother's bedside. She later revealed in a deeply moving statement that she had been fortunate to share the last 24 hours of her mother's life. Anne called it an honour and a privilege to accompany the Queen on her final journeys. She was listed as the informant on her mother's death certificate. She was the one who escorted the Queen's coffin at every single step of its journey from Balmoral to its final resting place. No one was closer to the Queen in those final, precious hours. This makes what happened in December 2025 all the more significant. Anne was conducting a routine review of certain estate documents. More than 3 years had passed since her mother's death, and there were still administrative matters that required periodic attention. This wasn't anything unusual. Royal estates are complex, and documentation needs to be examined and updated regularly. Anne, being the dutiful and thorough person she is, was working through these papers with her usual efficiency. Then she found it, a sealed envelope that had somehow been overlooked during the initial review of the Queen's will. The envelope was marked with instructions that it should only be opened during a full, comprehensive estate review and only by specific individuals. Princess Anne's name was on that list. Inside was a document in the Queen's own handwriting, dated March 2022. That date is crucial. March 2022 was exactly 6 months before Queen Elizabeth died. The Queen was 96 years old, and while she was still carrying out her duties, she knew that her time was limited. The handwriting on the document was instantly recognizable to Anne. It was her mother's script, though written in those final months when age had made the writing slightly shakier than it once was. But every word was deliberate. Every sentence is carefully constructed. This was not something the Queen had written casually or without deep thought. This was a codicil to her will, a hidden clause that addressed something the Queen had been unable to resolve during her lifetime. The document concerned Prince Harry. Anne's reaction in that moment must have been extraordinarily complex. Here was her nephew, a man who had left the royal family in 2020, who had given interviews criticizing the institution and individual family members, who had written a memoir filled with harsh assessments of his father and brother. Harry had caused the Queen considerable distress in her final years. Multiple sources have confirmed that the Queen was hurt by the way Harry and Meghan announced their departure, by the Oprah interview in March 2021 with its allegations of racism and lack of support, and by the ongoing public nature of family disputes. Anne herself has made her feelings about Harry quite clear, at least according to those close to her. Royal experts have noted that for Anne, loyalty is everything. She sees Harry as having betrayed not just his father and brother, but the entire royal institution that she has spent her life serving. One source told reporters in October 2025 that Anne isn't inclined to get involved in Harry's issues, that she feels he made his choice to step away from royal duties, and with that choice came the loss of family backing. Yet despite all of this, despite Anne's anger at what Harry had done, despite her unwavering support for her brother King Charles, here was a document from their mother asking Anne to do something that would require her to engage with the very situation she had tried to avoid. The provisions outlined in the document were detailed and specific. The Queen had set aside a substantial sum of money for Harry. Reports suggest somewhere between £15 and £20 million from her private estate. But this wasn't a simple gift. The money came with conditions, requirements that Harry would need to meet in order to receive his full inheritance. There were stipulations about time spent in the United Kingdom and Commonwealth countries, provisions specifically designated for Harry's children Archie and Lilibet, and frameworks that would require ongoing communication between Harry and the royal family. But perhaps most significantly, there was a personal letter from the Queen to Anne. This letter explained why Anne, and not King Charles, had been chosen to oversee this particular aspect of the will. The Queen's reasoning was both practical and emotional. She knew Anne's reputation for being straightforward and fair. She knew that Anne, as the spare to Charles's heir, understood what it meant to live in the shadow of an older sibling who would become monarch. She believed that Anne, despite her anger at Harry, might be able to see past the immediate conflict to something more important, the long-term well-being of the family and especially of Harry's children. The Queen wrote about her worries in those final months. She was concerned that Archie and Lilibet would grow up completely disconnected from their British heritage, that they would never know their grandfather the King, their uncle the Prince of Wales, their cousins George, Charlotte and Louis. She worried that the anger and hurt between the adults would create a permanent fracture that would extend down through generations. And she hoped, perhaps against hope, that by creating this framework, by setting these conditions and entrusting them to Anne, she might give the family a pathway back from the brink. Anne sat with these documents for a long time. The woman who had been at her mother's side in those final hours, who had heard her mother's last words, who had accompanied her body on its final journey, now held in her hands what might be considered the Queen's final attempt to heal the family she was leaving behind. It was a burden Anne had never expected to carry. It was a test of loyalty, but loyalty to whom? To her brother the King, who had been hurt by Harry's actions? To her nephew William, who by all accounts harbours deep resentment toward his younger brother? Or to her mother, whose dying wish now sat before her in fading ink? The discovery changed everything. Within hours, Anne would need to make decisions about how to proceed. She would need to inform King Charles about what she had found. She would need to consider the legal obligations created by her mother's will. And she would need to wrestle with her own conscience about what the right course of action might be. The clock had started ticking the moment she broke that seal, and there would be no going back. The document Princess Anne held in her hands was unlike anything she had expected to find among her mother's papers. Queen Elizabeth had always been meticulous about her affairs, careful about how she structured her legacy, and deeply thoughtful about the future of the monarchy. But this hidden clause revealed a side of the Queen's thinking that even her closest family members hadn't fully understood. It showed a grandmother who, in her final months, was willing to take extraordinary measures to try to keep her family intact. The financial provisions were substantial but carefully calibrated. The Queen had set aside approximately £20 million from her private estate specifically for Prince Harry. This wasn't money from the Crown Estate or the sovereign grant, which now belongs to King Charles. This was the Queen's own wealth, accumulated over 7 decades of careful management and wise investments. Under normal circumstances, when a monarch dies, virtually all of their wealth passes directly to their successor to avoid the 40% inheritance tax that would otherwise apply. This is why King Charles inherited the vast majority of his mother's estimated £500 million fortune, while his siblings Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward received only shares of the sovereign grant and selected personal items. But the Queen had made special provisions within her private holdings, carving out this specific sum for Harry. £20 million is a significant amount of money, enough to provide genuine financial security for Harry and his family for the rest of their lives. Yet it wasn't so large that it would overshadow the deeper purpose of the provision, or create accusations of favoritism that might inflame already tense family relationships. The Queen had thought this through carefully. However, the money wasn't simply gifted outright. The conditions attached to the inheritance were detailed and binding. According to the documents Anne was reading, Harry would only receive full access to the funds if he agreed to maintain meaningful connections to the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. The Queen's language was precise and left little room for interpretation. She required that Harry spend no fewer than 90 days per year on British soil or in Commonwealth nations. But this wasn't just about physical presence. The Queen specified that this time must be spent engaged in work that supported charitable causes or initiatives that benefited communities across the realm. This requirement revealed something important about the Queen's thinking. She wasn't demanding that Harry return to being a suds, working royal in the traditional sense. She had been too pragmatic for that. By early 2022, it was clear that Harry and Meghan had built a new life in California and had no intention of resuming their former roles. The Queen understood this reality, but she also believed that Harry's value to the Commonwealth and to the causes he cared about didn't have to disappear entirely. She was creating a framework that would allow him to continue doing meaningful work while maintaining connections to the world she had spent 70 years serving. The second major provision addressed Harry's children directly. Archie, who was born in May 2019, and Lilibet, born in June 2021, were the Queen's great-grandchildren. Despite the family tensions, despite everything that had happened between Harry and the rest of the royals, these children were still part of the family line. The Queen had designated approximately £5 million specifically for their education and upbringing. But again, there were stipulations. The funds would be managed by trustees who must be approved by both Harry and the reigning monarch. This meant that King Charles would have some oversight over how the money was used and invested. More significantly, the Queen specified that the children should spend meaningful time in the United Kingdom as they grew older. Her stated purpose for this requirement was clear and poignant. She wrote that her great-grandchildren should not become strangers to the land of their ancestors. She wanted Archie and Lilibet to understand their heritage, to know their family, and to have the opportunity to develop relationships with their grandfather, their uncle, and their cousins. This provision must have been particularly difficult for Anne to read. As someone who chose not to give her own children Peter and Zara royal titles, wanting them to have more normal lives, Anne understood the desire to protect children from the intense scrutiny of royal life. Yet here was her mother, asking that Harry's children be kept connected to that very world. The tension between protecting the children and maintaining family bonds was something the Queen had clearly grappled with in crafting these terms. But perhaps the most revealing part of the entire document was the personal letter the Queen had written to Princess Anne. This letter was attached to the legal provisions and was clearly meant to be read when the clause was discovered. In it, Queen Elizabeth addressed her daughter with a candour and vulnerability that was rare, even in private family communications. The Queen acknowledged the difficulty of the situation with Harry. She didn't minimise the hurt or the sense of betrayal that many in the family felt. She wrote that she understood the anger, the disappointment, and the profound sadness that had resulted from Harry's decisions and his public criticisms of the family. This wasn't a letter that tried to excuse or explain away what had happened. The Queen was facing the reality of the situation head-on. But then she wrote something that cut to the heart of why she had created this provision in the first place. She stated plainly that Harry was still her grandson, that his children were still her great-grandchildren, and that she could not leave this earth without trying one more time to ensure they would not be lost to the family completely. These words revealed the emotional weight the Queen had been carrying in her final months. Despite everything, despite the very public nature of the family breakdown, despite the damage done to the monarchy's reputation, she couldn't let go of the hope that somehow, some way, the bonds could be preserved. The letter to Anne contained a request that was phrased not as a royal command but as the hope of a dying mother. The Queen asked Anne to consider that bridges once burned can sometimes be rebuilt, but only if both sides are willing to supply the materials. This metaphor was telling. The Queen knew she couldn't force reconciliation. She couldn't make Harry and Charles forgive each other, or make William and Harry restore their once close relationship. But she could provide resources, both financial and structural, that might make rebuilding possible if the family members involved were willing to try. The Queen's inheritance clause, she explained in the letter, was her attempt to supply those materials. What Charles, Harry, Anne, William, and the rest of the family chose to build with them would be up to them. But she wanted them to have the resources, both financial and emotional, to make the attempt. She was, even in death, trying to be the matriarch who held the family together. Anne learned that the Queen had consulted with her most trusted legal advisors in drafting this document. Every word had been chosen to withstand legal scrutiny and to make the Queen's intentions crystal clear. The legal team confirmed that the clause was ironclad. It had been properly witnessed, correctly, filed and legally enforceable under British law. This wasn't a suggestion that could be easily dismissed or creatively reinterpreted. This was the will of a queen, documented in the proper legal fashion, and it had the full force of law behind it. The amount of money involved was significant, though perhaps not as large as some might expect given the Queen's total wealth. But the Queen had been shrewd in her calculations. She knew that too large a sum might create its own set of problems. It might make Harry seem like he was being bought, or it might fuel media narratives about special treatment and favouritism. £20 million for Harry, with £5 million designated for the children, was enough to provide genuine security and opportunity without overwhelming the deeper purpose of the provision. Because this really wasn't about money at all. The Queen had understood that. This was about connection, about family, about not letting the bonds break completely. The financial tzamset. Provisions were tools, means to an end, rather than the end itself. The real goal was to create a framework within which Harry might remain connected to his heritage and, more importantly, within which his children might grow up knowing their family. Reading through the document, Anne could almost hear her mother's voice in the phrasing. It was practical, yet emotional, firm, yet hopeful. The Queen had known she was dying when she wrote this. She had known that the situation with Harry would become Charles's problem to solve, and now Anne's problem as well. And so she had left them this, a tool perhaps, or a burden, or maybe both. It was a hidden clause in her will that was really a hidden plea, a final attempt to keep her family whole even as she prepared to leave it behind. The provisions were clear, the legal framework was solid, and the Queen's intentions were unmistakable. But now comes the hard part. Anne would need to decide what to do with this information. She would need to tell King Charles what their mother had done. She would need to navigate the complex family dynamics that would inevitably be triggered by this revelation. And she would need to determine whether she could, in good conscience, carry out her mother's wishes when doing so might conflict with her own sense of loyalty to the institution and to the family members who had stayed. The document sat before her, a testament to a grandmother's love and a monarch's final strategic move. Queen Elizabeth had played the long game throughout her 70-year reign, always thinking several moves ahead, always considering the long-term implications of present actions. And here, even in death, she was still playing that game, still thinking about the future, still trying to protect her family in ways they might not understand until the right moment came. That moment was now. Princess Anne sat alone with the weight of her mother's final wishes pressing down on her. The documents spread across the desk represented more than just legal provisions and financial arrangements. They represented a direct challenge to everything Anne believed about loyalty, duty, and the proper order of things within the royal family. To understand the depth of Anne's dilemma, you have to understand who she is and what she stands for in the modern monarchy. Anne has spent her entire adult life being what royal experts call the ultimate uncomplaining spare. Born in 1950, she was third in line to the throne at birth, behind her mother and her older brother Charles. She watched as Charles received the attention, the preparation, and the resources that came with being the heir. She never complained about playing second fiddle. She never publicly questioned why her gender meant she would be passed over in the succession by her younger brothers Andrew and Edward, at least until the succession laws were changed decades later. Instead, she simply got on with the work. And what work it has been. In 2024, Princess Anne completed 474 official engagements, making her the hardest working member of the royal family that year. In 2025, she completed 478 engagements, coming in second only to King Charles himself, who managed 532 despite undergoing weekly cancer treatment throughout the entire year. Anne has carried out more than 20,000 official engagements since her 18th birthday. She serves as patron to over 300 charities and organisations. She travels constantly, often carrying out multiple engagements in a single day, rarely seeking publicity or praise for her efforts. Royal biographer Dickie Arbiter said of Anne that she just gets on with it, a simple phrase that captures her entire approach to royal life. She doesn't seek the spotlight, she doesn't give controversial interviews, she doesn't write memoirs or sign lucrative deals with streaming platforms. She does her duty, day after day, year after year, without fanfare or complaint. This dedication has earned her enormous respect within royal circles and among the British public. She is seen as a beacon of old-fashioned public service, someone who understands that being royal is about service rather than celebrity. This background makes her feelings about Prince Harry particularly strong. From Anne's perspective, Harry had everything. He was born into privilege and position. He had the support of the institution, the love of his grandmother, and a role to play in supporting the monarchy. Yes, being the spare came with challenges. Anne knew that better than anyone. But in her view, Harry had chosen to abandon his responsibilities, to air private family grievances in public, and to profit from his royal status while simultaneously attacking the very institution that gave him that status. Multiple sources close to Princess Anne have described her feelings about Harry's departure and his subsequent behaviour. One insider told reporters in October 2025 that Anne isn't inclined to get involved in Harry's issues. She feels it's not her role. He decided to step away from royal duties, and with that choice, she believes, he also gave up the backing that comes with the family. Another source explained that Anne has always been about keeping her head down and focusing on her duties. She doesn't view it as her responsibility to sort out other people's messes, particularly when those difficulties stem from their own decisions. The language used by those close to Anne is revealing. They speak of loyalty being everything to her. They describe her as seeing Harry's actions as a betrayal, not just of individuals, but of the entire royal institution. Royal expert Jenny Bond suggested in July 2025 that Anne likely feels Harry has been extremely disloyal to his father, his brother, and the monarchy. For someone like Anne, who has dedicated her entire life to that institution, such disloyalty is almost incomprehensible. There's also the matter of what Harry's actions did to Queen Elizabeth in her final years. Anne was closer to her mother than perhaps any other family member in those last months. She was the one who spent the final 24 hours at the Queen's bedside. She saw firsthand the toll that family stress took on her aging mother. Royal commentators have noted that Anne has a soft spot for Harry, recognizing their shared experience as spares, but they've also observed that she is very unhappy with him for upsetting the Queen in her final years. The timing of events matters here. The Oprah interview aired in March 2021 when the Queen was 94 years old. Harry's memoir Spare, with its numerous criticisms of the family, was published in January 2023, months after the Queen's death, but Harry had been working on it for years before that. The Netflix documentary series about Harry and Meghan's life aired in December 2022, just 3 months after the Queen died. From Anne's perspective, Harry had caused their mother enormous pain and stress at a time when she should have been able to enjoy her final years in peace. Yet now Anne was being asked by that same mother to facilitate a reconciliation of sorts, or at least to oversee provisions that might lead to one. The contradiction must have been almost unbearable. How could she honour her mother's wishes when doing so seemed to reward the very behaviour that had hurt her mother so deeply? The family dynamics surrounding this discovery made the situation even more complicated. King Charles, Anne's older brother, and the person she has supported unfailingly throughout his life, has had his own difficult journey with Harry. Charles met with Harry privately in September 2025 at Clarence House in London. The meeting lasted about 55 minutes and represented the first time father and son had seen each other in person since February 2024. Harry's spokesperson later had to issue a statement denying reports that the meeting was distinctly formal and defending Harry against sources who were allegedly trying to sabotage any reconciliation between father and son. Charles is currently undergoing treatment for cancer, though he announced in December 2025 that his treatment schedule would be reduced in the new year thanks to early diagnosis and effective intervention. The King is 77 years old and dealing with the enormous pressures of his role while managing a serious health condition. Those close to the palace, including Queen Camilla, have expressed concern that stress from family drama could negatively impact his health and recovery. Queen Camilla herself reportedly has strong feelings about the Harry situation. According to sources, she doesn't understand why some family members keep reaching out to Harry. Her priority is protecting Charles, particularly given his health challenges. The tension with the Sussexes from Camilla's perspective only causes unnecessary stress and emotional exhaustion for the king. If Anne were to move forward with implementing the Queen's provisions for Harry, she would likely face opposition from Camilla, who has become an increasingly influential voice within the family. Then there's Prince William, Anne's nephew and the heir to the throne. Multiple reports throughout 2025 have described William's feelings toward his younger brother in stark terms. One source claimed that William simply hates Harry, using much stronger language than that. William views Harry's actions as betrayals of the worst kind. The relationship between the brothers, once remarkably close, has fractured perhaps beyond repair. William has made clear to his father that while he won't actively oppose any reconciliation efforts, he will not participate in them either. He will be civil if required by duty, but nothing more. The wounds between William and Harry run deep. Harry's memoir included criticisms of William and his wife Catherine. The public nature of these criticisms, shared with millions of readers worldwide, crossed a line that William apparently cannot forgive. If Anne were to actively work toward bringing Harry back into any form of contact with the family, she would be going directly against William's clearly stated preferences. This matters because William is the future of the monarchy. He will one day be king, and maintaining a good relationship with the heir is crucial for anyone in the royal family. Interestingly, Princess Catherine, William's wife, appears to be one of the few royals who maintains some form of contact with Harry. Reports suggest that Kate has been quietly urging William to consider reconciliation, that she values the bond the brothers once had, and hopes it might somehow be restored. Kate's position is complicated by her own health situation. She was diagnosed with cancer in early 2024 and announced in January 2025 that she was in remission. Her perspective on family relationships may have been affected by her own confrontation with mortality, but even Kate's gentle advocacy for reconciliation hasn't moved William from his position. Anne must consider all of these competing interests and emotions. There's her own anger at Harry's behaviour. There's her loyalty to Charles and her desire to protect him from additional stress. There's her understanding of William's position and her respect for the future king's feelings. There's Camilla's protective stance toward Charles. And underlying all of it is the knowledge that her mother, in her final months, specifically chose Anne to handle this situation precisely because she trusted Anne's judgment and fairness. The Queen's letter to Anne had explained why she was the right person for this task. As the spare who never complained, who built a life of meaningful service despite not being heir to the throne, Anne could understand Harry's struggles in ways that Charles and William perhaps could not. The Queen believed that Anne, despite her anger, might be able to see past the immediate conflict to the longer view. She might be able to recognize that Harry's children, innocent in all of this, deserved the chance to know their family and their heritage. But could Anne actually do what her mother was asking? Could she set aside her own feelings and her loyalty to Charles and William to carry out provisions that might be seen as giving Harry what he didn't deserve? The internal struggle must have been intense. Anne's entire life had been built on duty and loyalty, but now she faced a situation where different duties and different loyalties pulled her in opposite directions. Duty to her late mother's clearly expressed wishes, loyalty to her living brother, who was king, concern for her nephew, who would one day be king, and her own sense of what was right and wrong, earned through 74 years of life and 5 decades of royal service. The documents sat before her, legally binding and emotionally devastating. A decision would need to be made, and soon. The longer she waited, the more complicated the situation would become, but rushing into action without careful thought could make things worse. Anne, known for her measured and practical approach to problems, would need to find a way forward through one of the most difficult dilemmas of her life. The weight of Queen Elizabeth's hidden clause now rested squarely on Princess Anne's shoulders, and the path forward was far from clear. Anne had spent her entire life following a straightforward code: duty first, loyalty always, and service without complaint. But this situation demanded something more nuanced than her usual approach. It required her to balance competing obligations in a way that might satisfy no one, least of all, herself. The practical steps were clear enough, even if the emotional implications remained murky. Anne would need to formally notify Prince Harry about the inheritance and its conditions. This notification couldn't simply be a phone call or a casual letter. It would require proper legal channels, official documentation, and a framework that outlined exactly what Harry needed to do to claim his inheritance. The law firms that had handled the Queen's estate would need to be involved. Harry's own legal representatives in California would need to review the terms. There would be a specified period, likely 90 days, during which Harry could formally accept or reject the conditions his grandmother had set. The Queen had been remarkably strategic in how she structured the inheritance. The requirement that Harry spend 90 days per year in the United Kingdom or Commonwealth nations was significant, but not impossible. It amounted to roughly 3 months, which could be broken up across the year. Harry could potentially satisfy this requirement through a combination of charity work, family visits, and the various projects he still maintained connections to in Britain. But it would mean regular exposure to the British media, the very environment that Harry and Meghan had cited as toxic and damaging to their mental health. The provision regarding Archie and Lilibet created even more complex dynamics. The children are currently being raised in California, largely out of the public eye. Harry and Meghan have been fiercely protective of their privacy, rarely sharing photographs or details about their daily lives. The idea of trustees approved by King Charles having oversight of funds designated for the children's education would almost certainly feel intrusive to Harry and Meghan. More challenging still was the requirement that Archie and Lilibet spend meaningful time in the United Kingdom as they grew older. Would Meghan, who has made clear her reluctance to return to Britain, be willing to agree to such arrangements? The Queen had understood what she was asking. She knew these provisions would create tension and difficulty, but she had also believed, or at least hoped, that they were necessary to prevent Archie and Lilibet from growing up as complete strangers to their British heritage. At some point, those children would be old enough to ask questions about their family, their titles, their place in the royal lineage. The Queen wanted them to have actual relationships and experiences to draw on, not just stories and photographs. The possible outcomes of this situation ranged widely. In the best-case scenario, Harry might accept the terms and genuinely engage with the spirit of what his grandmother intended. He might bring his family to Britain regularly. Archie and Lilibet might develop relationships with their grandfather, their uncle, and their cousins. The inheritance might become the foundation for a slow, careful rebuilding of family bonds. A more realistic scenario was something messier and more partial. Harry might accept the money but approach the conditions with minimal enthusiasm. He might technically fulfill the requirement of 90 days per year while maintaining emotional distance. This would be a kind of reconciliation, but not the healing transformation the Queen had hoped for. The worst-case scenario was one where the inheritance became another source of conflict. Harry might publicly complain about the conditions, viewing them as attempts to control him from beyond the grave. The media would feast on such a narrative, turning the Queen's final attempt at peacemaking into its opposite. Anne knew that whatever decision she made, it would be scrutinised and criticised. If she moved forward with notifying Harry and implementing the provisions, some would see her as betraying her loyalty to Charles and William. If she found a way to quietly set the matter aside, she would be defying her mother's clearly expressed final wishes. Yet perhaps that was exactly why the Queen had chosen Anne for this task. Elizabeth had known her daughter well. She knew Anne's sense of duty was absolute, that Anne would struggle with this decision, but would ultimately find a way to act according to her conscience. As the December daylight faded outside the palace windows, Princess Anne remained with her mother's documents, the hidden clause that was hidden no longer. Somewhere in California, Prince Harry had no idea that his grandmother had spent her final months thinking about him and his children, trying to build one last bridge across the divide. Soon enough, he would learn what the Queen had done, and Princess Anne, the hardest-working royal who never complained, faced the hardest decision of her life.